First of all, I would like to give you some visual impressions about this workshop. As you can see here on the bottom left, a group of stakeholders at the beginning of the workshop where we facilitated the warming up, just to start to give the energy from the workshop to you. So we asked the participants critical questions like, research results on climate change are complicated. I don't understand the technical details. Do you agree or disagree? This type of exercise, moving these people around, engaging them in a discussion, was a very good start for such a workshop to set up. On the top right, you see a group of NGO representatives discussing the influence of climate change, also just an example of interaction. And at the bottom left, the representative of the Environmental Management Authority explains a very complex diagram on the influence of climate change. This as background on what type of activity we are looking at. The main activity of this workshop was synthesizing the key messages that we had generated from AgMIP phase 1 with stakeholders. And here I would just like to highlight a few important elements to you on how we prepared this distillation of key messages that made it at the end a successful exercise. First of all, we had been working on these messages since already 2013, so it was nothing new. We all were familiar with these messages. We as a team, everybody contributed to these messages, like Olivier on the climate aspects, Patricia on crops and diversification, Katrina on livestock, myself on economics. So as a team, we moved these messages around and worked on each, and at the end we crystallized those messages and worked on them with Swati. Not everybody knows her yet, but she's a communication specialist at ICRISAT. And being an external person, so not a scientist, was very helpful to really transform these messages out of that scientific, sometimes complicated jargon into 5 basic themes that we prepare to hand over to stakeholders so that they would flesh them out during the workshop and do with these messages what they thought is important for them. So once we had boiled down these messages, we visualized them using some of Sherry's example, emphasis on very simple visualization on one message per slide. And before the actual workshop, the last step was then to use these messages again as a team and discuss them with participants who were not necessarily part of the preparation of these messages. And already that led to a heated discussion where we could feel, yes, these messages are powerful and we will be able to get a buy-in during the workshop. This is preparations for the synthesis of the key messages. Then at the actual workshop itself, I myself presented these 5 themes. I had, I had a dry run with Swati to make sure that these messages come over very clear in their language. After about 15-minute presentation and asked feedback questions to this presentation, we asked the stakeholders to choose, to pick just one of these messages, and taking care that we would have mixed groups of stakeholders per message who would then go and work these messages out. We allocated then a full hour for these as key exercise that groups would first, each group would first discuss the message and then follow a guideline that we had presented with questions and really flesh out if they agreed with this type of message, if the message created questions in the stakeholders, whom they think needs to know about this, and how they would use it, what they would do differently now in their day-to-day activities. In this type of group work, we had, in each of these 5 groups, we had one project staff who documented the discussion, including a recorder, and also collected the forms. So we later on can still go back when we document this discussion and see where were the issues, what was a bone of discontent, and how did they go about interpreting these messages. As an observation, we can say that immediately throwing these messages at stakeholders, asking them to make them their own, created a heated debate. They were very passionate about improving the messages, not only in terms of their content, but also in their way of visualization, editing, asking methodological issues. So it was really helpful for us even to go back and clearly state the methodology behind those messages. So because of having an inclusive process, participatory process, we then allocated another hour for the feedback of each group on what they thought they learned or what were the critical issues emerging to the discussion with regards to their message. And on top of that, Swazi videoed these feedback presentations. All in all, the feedback took another hour. So for the fleshing out of the messages, we calculated in terms of time a full afternoon. And as a part of preparation after the workshop, we debriefed in the evening of the workshop, documented all our observations, and yeah, Swathi has already shared the video, the discussion on Google Drive. I'm not sure if I should stop here after the first component of this webinar, or should I continue and go through the rest as well? Hello?
Swathi? Yeah, hi, it's Amy. If anybody has questions right now, clarification, or other points that you'd like to just kind of put on the table, go ahead and do that now. If you don't get any, then Sabine, please go ahead and we'll entertain all of the questions once you've wrapped up. Either way is fine.
Okay, I don't hear anything from anybody. I continue. The second block of this webinar was the question on how did we identify the participants for this workshop and potential participants for future users of the Impact Explorer, or in general our stakeholders. So overall, just to let you know that we had 5 stakeholder groups present in the workshop, representing 5 different scales: government department at district level, government district level important for the grounding, and representing the farmer representation. We didn't have farmers themselves, but extension as district level extension as the closest to the ground. Then government departments at provincial and national level. The other group was research and universities, then local NGOs and national NGOs. Maybe worthwhile to mention that at the beginning of the workshop we handed out rosettes with colors, which you saw on the first slides. For each of these groups a different color, which made it easier for us to recognize what type of constellation of people we found and what type of groups. And it was really funny because they used these rosettes also on their presentation, so it seemed to become a mark of identification. So throughout these groups we had a very good mix of technical backgrounds. We had people from climate, from crops, livestock, environment, economics, policies, and the civil society. We had, as I said, government extension, but also development research in the private sector. We had the district, intermediate, and national levels, and we had people from previous partnerships, and we also engaged new people, so origins of these participants. And how do we got to these type of participants? We built largely on our own experience, because we have been working in these various districts at the provincial level, at the national level, our own experience within AgMIP, but also we consulted other ICRISAT colleagues on which type of expert they would recommend, where did they have good experience of reliable and committed personnel. Although our AgMIP site was originally in Ankai, just one district, we extended to 3 districts because we felt we need a broader heterogeneity of districts being representative. And we also know that from stakeholders' perspective, it's important that we just don't focus on one district, but have a representation across the provincial, the various districts that make up a province in Matabeleland. We also, since it's not only about EquiSat, but we have national partners on board, like Matopos Research Institute through Trinity and GVS. We asked them, and they are more into livestock production, while EquiSat traditionally is a crop research institute. So they came up with more partners from the NGOs and the private sector, who turned out to be really critically important on this meeting.
Hi, Sabina. There's a couple of questions in the chat if you want to take a look.
So this is how do I find that?
On the side, on your control panel. Can you find the control panel? I can read them.
Yeah, I'm going through them.
It's one from Olivier. He asks, was the workshop Makai specific or limb specific, other, and given the different scales, local to national and stakeholder, did you face scale issues in communicating the messages?
I mean, our focus site is in Kai, but we purposely selected stakeholders from beyond Kai in our aim that we want to tease out engaging stakeholders from different perspectives to use Kai as an example. So it's difficult to say, okay, it was beyond Kai, but it still had the focus on Kai as the example site where we had generated the data from. I wouldn't say that we faced scale issues in the discussion. It was more in the communication of the messages, because we had precisely said that these messages refer to Kai. It's clear that they can be scaled out to limited areas. It's not valid, they are not valid for the entire country. But I had a feeling that stakeholders on one side understood this issue, on the other side they asked us critical questions like how can the AgMIP approach be scaled out to be representative for the entire country. So that as a questions to the future, but for this purpose it was clear and we didn't have an issue. Any representation from local Armin, sorry, what is that? Local minister. I don't understand the question from Lakshman. As I said, we did not have farmers per se present, but extension, because we believe that in this context of decision making, it's about influencing decisions on advisory services. Farmers will be the ultimate benefits, but we also felt that this discussion would be probably at a higher level than the immediate farmers, which could then make farmers uncomfortable. But overall, and we don't have currently a strong representation of farmer associations, so yeah, for now we did not include farmers. On policy planners at top level, yes, we had involved those policy planners at top level. We have the University of Zimbabwe, who is leading the consultative process on climate change policy. They were represented. And there is a government department on climate. They call themselves Climate and Environment, and this department was not present because they were out in the field. There are only 3 people, and so it was more of a logistic issue, but we hope to invite them for the workshop in Victoria Falls. When and what is the duration of the workshop? We had planned purposely 1.5 days only, knowing that these people are extremely busy, so they would arrive on the day and on the evening before the start of the workshop, have a full day 1 and a half day 2, and people would have the opportunity of day 2 either, we organized a field tour in the afternoon of day 2, but provided so much time that they could still go home. I saw the last chat by Amadouli. I assume that was the last question.
Yeah, I think so. Sabine, why don't you go back in and pick up your slides where you left off, and I think you have a few left, and then we can pick up the discussion again.
Okay. What's happening to my screen? Okay, here coming to the design of this workshop, the entire design on how we organize this workshop to make sure as good as we could that we would engage stakeholders from the beginning. In terms of preparation, as I said before, we had a transdisciplinary team, like the different scientists with their different expertise involved, as well as these 2 outsider communication specialists, Swathi and Shari, advising, leading us through the process. And we paid from the beginning a lot of attention on the learning process, and Swathi was very, very supportive of that, meaning we thought through in very much detail, also with the stakeholder unit with Amy and Wendy Lin, on the objectives, the activities, to make sure that the whole process of the workshop really builds step by step on it. Swathi developed a very, very detailed program on what are the different components of the workshop, what do we want to achieve by that, who is responsible for that, when is this all going to happen, and we are now revising that program also in very much detail to have it as a base for learning for the rest of the AgMIP team and ourselves, of course. In our preparations, we included a diversity of methods from the beginning to keep these people active, avoid a classroom situation, like as I tried to show on the first image, we came together. We sat on around round tables. There was no lines of tables. We could move around between these tables. We could move around the front side of the room. We opened the workshop by asking people questions and walking along a line from one extreme to the other. Do they agree? Do they disagree with this type of question? We would argue and discuss with people as an interactive exercise to warm ourselves up. We had other methods where group work presentations. We kept these presentations very, very short. There were only 5 presentations. The rest was group work and presentations by the group, and even the feedback of presentations and videoing those were kind of animative for the team. In terms of preparations, we also defined clear task for the implementation, as I tried to mention. We had 3 facilitators from within our own team, like myself, Patricia, and another scientific officer from ICRISAT. We have a team of 5 documenters that we put along the whole process to make sure that we not only document the discussion in summary form, but we really want to document exactly what people said and what the observations during the process. We also defined upfront the presentations and the presenters very well. We gave very clear instruction on what presentation we expect, what time, very precise, so that we avoid long presentations, and which actually don't bring in much new information. Task for workshop implementation also considered logistics so that the entire workshop would flow. It worked quite well. And then we had asked upfront the stakeholders which venue they would prefer, because we thought we would embed these workshops in existing governmental, provincial level structures. We found out that these structures do not really exist. And also stakeholders wanted to come to ICRISAT because they wanted to visit the fields and see what kind of climate smart, etc. technologies we can combine and expose, demonstrate parallel or after the workshop. The last preparation point is that we had a half-day meeting as a team, just amongst ourselves, to go through the program in detail, talk through the presentations, through the messages, and as I mentioned before, this in itself ended up in a very heated discussion on how we proceed, what do we think about these messages. People suggested additional messages. We decided to take them out because we wanted to keep the workshop, the messages short and in a frame. Then during the workshop itself, we had a warm welcome. The country representative welcomed everybody. We had these lively introductions. And as mentioned already, we engaged people on these critical issues like what does climate change mean to them, how do they perceive climate change impact through this exercise on walking and group formation around different topics. As I also said before, we had very few presentations, and we did not start the workshop with presentations. We had one exercise entirely on what do people think about climate change, and the second one was in groups, in stakeholder groups, to develop a sort of diagram of how do they think climate change influences their lives or the livelihoods of their target groups. And each group would then present such diagram, and only at the late morning, after 3 hours of discussing already, we started with very technical presentations on how does the Climate Meteorological Office visualize climate variability and change, and that was followed by a presentation on perceptions of climate change by farmers. So we started by stakeholders' own perceptions about climate change, and only after that gave them information on what science presents and thinks about climate change, which I think was very successful. We then allocated a whole afternoon for distilling these messages. So we really gave ourselves time for that. An important point here is that we need to avoid that stakeholders come up with general assumption that it's a perspective, like what does a stakeholder, or what do I perceive about climate, I act about climate change as a stakeholder representing a stakeholder group. The other point, we are engaging participants in feedback presentation was also very important. We really left time for that, and that was important. What I had not mentioned before is that we had a pre and post workshop survey, asking people before the workshop what they expect, what do they know about climate change, and after the workshop to see if they really, what have they learned during this 1.5 day. We haven't evaluated this yet, but it could be a good assessment on verifying to ourselves when the process took place. And after the workshop, we again shared our observations and are documenting now the process lessons. I saw.
Sabine, do you want to go ahead and go into your last slide, and then we'll manage the questions and the responses after that. Is that okay? Or was that the last slide?
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah, okay. Okay, so successes and challenges from the workshop. We as a facilitating team agreed all that the energy levels during this workshop were really high. There was commitment from all stakeholders, which really made us happy. We acknowledged that we had a strong team of participants, like really experienced people from these different levels and different technical backgrounds. The stakeholders themselves were happy. They didn't feel extracted from the workshop, but they felt this moment of learning, of exchanging, and it looked for us as if they just had waited for this kind of activity. So it really proved to us that the given challenges in this particular country, or anyways, especially in the agricultural sector, meets a great interest. We considered as a success the way how we had distilled the messages. Like, we had prepared we asked them to please be open, free, criticize our messages, do with them whatever they felt, and we felt that we are now working like it wasn't our message anymore. It wasn't our AgMIP message anymore. It became ours as the workshop's messages. That was a key highlight. Another that we, throughout this process, we engaged with stakeholders. We tested all these different methods. We had different styles of presentations, of documentation, of logistics, and we as a team were very clear ourselves on what the exact role of the impact is, and they confirmed that it meets their interest. So stakeholders had very precise questions, and they challenged us about very concrete and packaged information about crops and livestock and solutions at different scales, even cultural aspects on how on. And in this regard, we were not always able to give very clear answers on, technically what AgMIP objectives are, we know, but how far can we technically go? How far can we lead the stakeholder engagement? Where will it be beyond AgMIP resources? So we ended up vague. And also about the Impact Explorer, we had discussed it with Joske and the rest of the team that it was left open for us, and this is very good all the time, because we sometimes struggled, for example, how to explain users and stakeholders to stakeholders, because they required more really user-friendly terms in this regard. And what is the function of a user, of a stakeholder? How does it differentiate, etc. Yeah. So these were maybe the others of the team are welcome to add to these successes and challenges, or to any other aspects as well.
Sabine, first of all, thank you very much. I think you've set the stage very well. For those of you that were not involved in this process, if it seems like it takes a lot of time, it does. Engagement is not once off. Wendy Lynn and I speak frequently about this idea of iterative engagement. You're building relationships that you plan to maintain over long periods of time, and it takes an investment of time and resources. So thank you and your team for setting us up very well for the rest of the time. First, as Sabine said, does anyone else on the CLIP team who was involved in this, do you have some more details you'd like to fill in or other points you'd like to make or emphasize some of the successes and challenges?
I think she has mentioned everything.
Okay, I couldn't hear that very clearly.
Okay, I said, I think she has presented everything. I don't have anything to say.
Thanks, Patricia. Swathi, I've just seen in here a question from Carolyn, and she has gone right to the heart of the matter, and that is, can you give us some impressions about this process of messaging? And how would you characterize the messages that you started with, even though those had gone through many internal processes, and how the group then handled those? What was that like?
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Um,
Okay, Sabina,
Yes,
were
I
you
could
going to
hear
answer that? Or did you want me to?
it's fine. Go ahead, Swazi.
Okay, I think what we're trying to put together is a set of, in this Google Drive folder that we've created, we've kind of tried to capture the messages at different stages along the way, so that people can see how we tried to work with those messages until you get this sort of, not really a final product, but the product that we worked with during this meeting. I think that should be really helpful for people to look through and see how the idea evolved over time. I think one of the things that was difficult was trying to be specific without being too technical, but also not going so general that you end up saying something that we didn't actually need a lot of research to show. For example, something like, oh, diversification is really good and farmers should do more of it. I think farmers know that, NGOs know that, government knows that. So then, to say, okay, it's not just diversification, it's diversification into these specific things, gives you these specific benefits that we have been able to quantify so that you can see if it's worth pushing this as an agenda or discussing this approach with your farmers. So it was, I think that getting that balance right was a challenge. We either started off with very, very vague messages, and then we had to make them more substantive, or we ended up having some really super technical messages that we then felt, okay, is this true for like everyone in Inkai? Is this true for just a certain subpopulation within this population that we were working with? How can we take it a little bit larger so that other people could use it constructively? So I feel like that getting that balance right is really, it's not just important, but it gives the message some meat. So yeah, I think off the top of my head, I would say that that was the balance that we tried to get to with our messages.
Swathi, how much of that work did you have to do beforehand and those iterations among your teams? Sabina made a point of telling everyone that the entire team was sitting down working through these, and you had some pretty serious, not disagreements, but discussions among yourselves beforehand. What do you think in terms of a balance? How much of that gets done beforehand, and who is critical to that process? And then how much of it can reasonably be expected to be done with these audiences in the room?
I think almost all of it was done beforehand. We did it as part of our prepping for the meeting. What we then got from workshopping it with stakeholders was a better idea of where we were successful and what we could then work on. But it also raised for them other questions that they then said, you know, we would like to see this sort of crop in this picture that you're presenting to us. So then it was like, okay, we need to do more research on, you know, or change the model in this way to accommodate other crops. Or it was like pointing to different types of research that we could then get AgMIP modelers to try to look at, or, you know, so it opened up more questions and provided us with maybe different types of visualizations that we could then try. So I think we did a lot, and I'm really confident with our messages. We did a lot beforehand, and then what happened at the meeting was more of a tweaking and a fine-tuning so that people could actually start to work with it. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, that starts to answer the question. Just so that everyone on the call is aware, Sabine alluded to the fact that Sherry worked with them on the messages as well. And there was this idea of visualizing them and visualization, because depending upon the audience, you're not going to be winning a lot with detailed charts and graphs. So you need some creativity in other ways to be able to get your point across and put it in front of everybody. Can we have questions, comments, feedback? I know that the Southern India team had an event not long ago as well. If Dr. Lakshmanan has something to add to this. Sherry's just added a question here. I'm not sure who's best placed to answer that. Sabine, if you're still available to us.
I'm here. Sorry. She said, can I repeat what I said? She lost me, but I can't. I don't.
Hi, Sabine.
No, there's a question here from Sherry now, Sabine, that says, how did the stakeholders respond to uncertainty? Did they understand that some messages like precipitation are still not certain? What were those conversations like?
I have to say that myself now, we cut the group in. So this was part of a climate message, which was presented in a group where I was not part because I was in the variability group. Overall, I have to pass now. I can't.
If I could jump in, I would say that you know, it's really interesting what people need and what they felt was really critical for them. I think the uncertainty, they were okay with that. They don't want very specific predictions necessarily. They were like, okay, well, we could live with the uncertainty. We just need to know how best to proceed. So they were more focused on the, what do we do given this uncertainty? It didn't bother them that we couldn't give them very specific data on what was going to happen. And then the other thing that people, I know someone else asked this earlier, but you know, in terms of taking that message and making it their own for their own district, they didn't really have a problem with that. Even though the data was in Kai, there was like a couple of people who said, does this apply to us as well? But a lot of them were talking as though it already did apply to them and what they have seen in the field and what their experiences dealing with this sort of situation have been. So I felt like, okay, maybe what we bring as AgMIP is perhaps like we can say it's 83% as opposed to 62%, but for them it's like, well, I could still work with either of those numbers because what I need to do on a day-to-day basis, I'm still going to have to do it, whether it is 60% or 80%. So, and it kind of came out as well in one of our first questions that we asked them at the beginning, where it was like, I'm not able to it was something along the lines of the research that people do is really technical and I don't understand all of it, and that makes me it makes it hard for me to do my job, was kind of what it said. And people said, no, we agree with the first part of the sentence, that climate research is really technical and we don't understand all of it, but you know what, it doesn't stop us from doing our job. I thought that was really interesting. So on a day-to-day basis, in terms of what people would have to do with that uncertainty and how they'd have to deal with it, there's only so much that they could do, and they already know that. So they weren't necessarily like put off by the fact that we couldn't give them 100% on, you know, what's going to happen.
If I may come in, I have two comments on this. One is about the consensus on climate variability, and number two is on the complexity. So number one, we had a climatologist on presenting the historical trends in climate variability. We had somebody who presented on farmers' perceptions on climate variability, and we then provided our future projections, and these three actually matched very, very well. And it seemed like everybody understand that the rainy season is becoming shorter, but more variable. So it became this kind of uncertainty, I think, became tangible on the rainfall side. And second, this complexity, they all agree that, okay, variability of rainfall, increasing variability of rainfall, is one thing, but it's the effect of climate plus all these other economic factors that together make it very difficult for people to act and plan ahead.
Okay, Sabine, we may have lost you, although I'm not sure if you had finished your point or not. I'm seeing the comments coming in. I don't know if Sonali, if Swathi and Sabine have taken care of your question. From my side, I know your group has thought about what next, because that's a big part of this now. You've started a process. You're not just going to walk away with what you were given and never be seen and never engage again. Can one of you from the CLIP team please just give everybody a general overview? What do you plan to do next? What's going to happen with the outputs of this meeting? How do you expect to build on this engagement and develop these relationships going forward?
In terms of our accountability to the entire group. It's important, and stakeholder found it extremely important that we share the documentation of this process with them. We then have the opportunity to bring selected stakeholders to the Victoria Falls meeting, which I think is a great opportunity to think through some of our shortfalls, like Impact Explorer with a smaller group of stakeholders as a team. I think we will take it further from there.
Can I add something else?
Please, Patricia.
One thing that we realized was, given the limitations, for example, of what we can do within the AgMIP project, and the time scale that we have, is that we came up with a number of, there are people who would want to do some collaborative work, for example, with NGOs like World Vision, and also some of the private, from a private sector, for example, a dairy farm, who actually would want to use some of their data that they have to actually see the impact of climate change. So there are possible future collaborations which can further enhance the work that we have started.
Thanks, Patricia. And just so everyone else is aware, we are working with Sabine and her team on how best to structure the engagement during the Vic Falls meeting. We're particularly going to focus on getting input into Impact Explorer and giving Sander, Joska, Hugo, and their team some opportunities to really focus in on what kinds of things Impact Explorer would be most useful for, according to the stakeholders that are going to be there. And again, this will be a subset of some of these that were engaged in the CLIP meeting in early May. We've got a few minutes left, and Carolyn asks a very important question. That is, is Conductor Lakshmanan or someone else from either the Southern Indian team or the IGB team or Pakistan? Would you like to share some of your experiences? Do you think this approach will work, or have you been able to already do this where you are? It might be too late in the day. Okay, we've got 5 minutes left. Other questions, points? We don't have to type them in. We can. People can unmute and ask away. I see one's come in. Okay. This goes back specifically, Sabine, to your team, and it was asked. It's now been posed twice. And that is, have you consulted the climate team or crop modeling team for key questions? So how much did those teams have input into the messaging and into the meeting and the interaction with the stakeholders?
Especially since our climate expert Olivier wasn't present at the workshop, I had an intense conversation with him before on what type of questions we can ask, what type of contributions of the climate presentations would be useful for this audience, since for me as a social scientist this is a black box, but I learned a lot in this process. It was also very good to guide the meteorologists in his presentation. So I basically use questions from Olivier and posted those questions to the meteorologist to be presented during the meeting. Patricia herself was part of the, Patricia as a crop modeler was part of the workshop, plus another Zimbabwean crop modeler, AgMIP crop modeler. So they posted their questions directly. But for example, in the messages, we did not come up with a very crop-specific message. We left the messages, each message responded to one of these big issues, like what about something about climate, vulnerability, and crop-specific messages were part of an adaptation package, so we did not have very crop-specific messages per se.
Sabine, will you go back to one of your earlier slides? Dilys came in a bit late, and she's wondering what the composition was of the stakeholder participants in the meeting. It'd be nice if you can just show kind of the breakdown of where they came from, please. Also, the team did an excellent job documenting and organizing all of the materials that they generated evolving this meeting, and those are going to be made available certainly to all of the stakeholder liaisons through the website, and maybe more broadly than that once we've refined them sufficiently. So everyone will have access to the process particularly that this team used, and like Carolyn said before, the iterations, what the messages looked like from beginning until at least how they were manipulated during the meeting itself and what some of the feedback was on that. So that will all be made available, and it's already well organized, so that should help most of the teams going forward. Okay, we're very near the end. We won't keep anyone over. Dilys, did you get to see what the breakdown of the participants were? That's the slide that's on the screen now. Okay. All right. Sabine, I'd like to thank you and Patricia and Swathi and Olivier and Martin and everyone else that was involved in getting this from where you guys were a few weeks ago to where you've reached. I think you've done a very good job, and your documentation and the lessons from this are going to be extremely important, not just to this group going forward, but in terms of what comes out of AgMIP's stakeholder unit approach, principles, and that. I think your group has done a great job, and it's a lot to build on, certainly in Vic Falls at the end of next month, but then also going forward. Anyone else? Do you have some final thoughts, Sabine or Swathi or Patricia? Okay. So Carolyn just asked to briefly review expectations and prep for the next webinar and the workshop. We've sent each of the stakeholder liaisons an email that has our best guess details in terms of the stakeholder unit sessions we'll be convening. We've asked for feedback on those, but important to that is going to be a focus on this idea of messaging. The exercise that the CLIP team has gone through, and I know that many of the other teams have already invested time and energy in this, but we're going to work some more on that to prepare messages to be turned over to stakeholders for deeper engagement. In terms of the preparation for the workshop, we had asked that each stakeholder liaison get back to us by the end of this month, which is May, with a summary of each of the RRT's engagements to date. So we've asked the stakeholder liaisons to work with each of the RRTs to understand better who exactly has participated in the process, which stakeholders were engaged, for example, in developing the RAPs, some of the scenarios, and some of the other events. Who has been accompanying the RRTs along this path? Who are people, processes, and institutions that you need to keep track of and stay engaged with as we get deeper into phase 2, which is passing quickly. So we'll spend a lot of time working toward the best approach to keeping those involved and making sure that the other necessary complicated stakeholders in each of the regions gets engaged in the process for phase 2. So those are our expectations. The next webinar, which is meant to be, I think, June 11th, is going to be managed mainly by the team from Wageningen and Altera, who are working on the Impact Explorer. So you'll be hearing a lot from Sander, Joska, and Hugo in the lead up to that. And they're going to try and refine some of the questions that we all still have and make that frame a bit more refined before we get to Vic Falls and engage there with the people that CLIP are going to bring in. Okay. Other comments, questions? I don't know why nobody's talking and why they're all typing. Okay, thank you everybody. I really appreciate those of you who got up early and stayed up late to join us today. And we'll make sure that the documentation from this webinar is available, but also the background documents that the CLIP team has developed. Thank you, everyone.